about DEI and how to get started with simple processes that you can use to start taking action on DEI right away. There are a lot of resources out there, great resources for educating yourself on issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes we add accessibility to that acronym as well. But there are a limited number of resources I've found to help you just get started doing the work beyond the education right away. And more importantly, I think there's an issue at play here, which is that the education is great, but if you don't have the processes in place to start taking action, that education isn't going to go very far. But if you have at least some basic diversity, equity, inclusion processes in place, and then you get some education or you do a workshop session with somebody, then that is going to have much bigger impact overall on your organization and the kind of change you can make in this area. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Livieri. I'm a #1 international best-selling author, creator of the Impact Method, and a former executive director. And I love helping nonprofits and their executive directors get unstuck, make a bigger impact while becoming financially sustainable. So let's get started with this 15-minute micro training. So here I have 3 pictures. I have a pilot's cockpit, I have a surgery room, and I have my picture here representing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my question for you is, what do all 3 of these things have in common? If you're here with me live, you can put your answer in the chat if you want. Otherwise, I'm not going to torture you, and I'm going to tell you what cockpits, surgery rooms, and diversity, equity, and inclusion all have in common. And the answer is checklists. Maybe not what you were expecting. So these are all actually, there's another answer, which is that these are all complex situations and dynamics. So, and here's a great quote from the book, The Checklist Manifesto. Under conditions of complexity, not only are checklists a help, they are required for success. And actually, if we think about my 3 pictures for a moment, it was really the airline industry that started using checklists. It may have been the military, I'm not sure, but pilots who started using checklists to make sure they didn't miss anything, that famous pre-flight checklist. And it was the surgeons, I believe, who learned this approach, this tactic from the pilots to do the same thing in surgery. And in both cases, the results of adding checklists in a very complex and dynamic environment dramatically improved results. And I believe the same can be true in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what kind of checklists might we be talking about? Well, I'm going to give you some example things that you can have in your checklists. But first, I want to talk about where you're going to use a checklist, right? So kind of the big work that you might do periodically and you might undertake with a DEI specialist is to review your systems and processes with a DEI checklist, saying, you know, where do we have issues? Where are we making our systems and processes more robust around diversity, equity, inclusion? And where are we already doing a great job and our systems are less prone to things like biases? Now, this can be a big project to take on. But you can certainly start it today with one of the checklists that I'm going to give you in just a moment. Another place to do this, and you can use this as part of your big review process, or you can just start adding DEI checklists to your existing systems and processes. So if you're doing an activity, you can just create a checklist, which is just checking, is this process, is this that we just went through, is it prone to bias? Or maybe another way to use the checklist is to say, did we safeguard against these elements, or did we consider and take action around the elements in this checklist? So those are the 2 places, and you can update these anytime. But even if you haven't, you can take this to a very sophisticated level, but even if you're just in the beginning stages of implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to all your work, then just adding these checklists, just bringing that next level of awareness, reminding yourself to put on that lens, put on those DEI glasses each time you go and take action in the world, will start having actually probably dramatic results with relatively little effort, even if your staff isn't well educated. And if they're not educated, it's probably going to push them to start asking some questions and requesting some more support along the way. So what might this checklist look like, you ask? So here is, I've got kind of two examples. You can pull from these and create your own checklist. You can add words, but I wanted to keep it simple for today. So here's kind of one inclusive list of things to consider. We've got race, sex, disability, genetic information, sexual orientation, marital status, color, gender identity or expression, citizenship, religion, age, national origin. So these might be more or less applicable depending on your specific situation. And here is kind of another reworking of the same checklist. This one actually came from this link below, which actually is a resource that has a bunch of educational material. It's a free resource. I haven't been through the whole thing, so I can't say I recommend it or not recommend it, but I found this summary checklist helpful. So gender awareness, developmental and acquired disabilities, language, variability in language skills and a reading level, ethnicity, geographical location, faith-based beliefs, religious or spiritual, culture. Program implementation here, things you making the program accessible, braille, large print, sound audio, translations and such. Socioeconomic status, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and ADA compliance. So you can create different checklists that might be appropriate for your various processes. Let's talk about an example for a moment. So let's say you have a hiring process, or you're just about to hire somebody. Maybe you don't have a formal hiring process written out. Well, we're going through those two lenses. Can we check on the process overall? And can we add a checklist to the process? So from the check on the process overall, you might ask yourself, well, where is this process vulnerable to biases in gender awareness, in gender or sex, language, culture? You know, what are the things that we can change in the process itself? So for example, you might kind of strip out certain identifying information from resumes that you're viewing. Maybe you don't look at name or where they're from or any of that kind of information that might reveal to you someone's gender or race. There's maybe some other things you can kind of make the process kind of more blind, and then you don't have to worry about how biased you are as you review them, because you won't have the opportunity for those biases to come into play. Now, at some point, you probably are going to want to have a live interview with a person. That's a great hiring practice for many reasons, but it is very prone to all sorts of biases. Everything that you can be biased about based on how somebody looks or communicates is going to come up. And that's where you can add a checklist on the back end. Say, even the front end. So you can say before the interview, you read this checklist, you confirm that you're going to be as aware as possible of any biases you might be experiencing during the interview. And then afterwards, you could also go through the checklist process saying, these are the areas where I may have my opinion may have been skewed, or where I need to, make some adjustments. So just bringing that awareness as a simple checklist in part during the process itself can be extremely, extremely valuable and set you on a path to doing a lot of deep work. But the initial work of just creating that checklist and saying, as part of the interview process, the interviewer fills out, completes this checklist confirming that they have made adjustments or been aware of how their own biases may have impacted their assessment of the overall interview. Now, let's take it one level deeper and think about, how are we really choosing to take action? Where are we deciding, and how far do we go in changing our processes and adding checklists to processes? And I think it's helpful, especially if you're a small organization, to be aware that there's kind of two places that biases and inequities of all sorts, the things that make it harder to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive, come into play. So there's our internal biases and inequities. We have a lot of control over those things. So, we can say, hey, I'll use that hiring process example again. We can take a lot of action in the interviewing process, in the assessment process of the candidates. And then we have some control. We can definitely decide where we do outreach, where do we promote this position to get candidates from. Then we have external biases and inequities. Now, while we have control over where we do outreach, there's this external world of there might be a long history of inequity and biases. So maybe you are an organization who's hiring an IT person and you would like your process not to be biased, but the reality might be that it is significantly harder to find female candidates over male candidates because there aren't as many potential female candidates because there is a long history of bias and exclusion of female candidates, and especially of female candidates of color. So that you have to decide how far are you going to go to kind of proactively make a dent and tip the scales in these internal biases. And I want to give you kind of a bonus pro tip here of how to kind of navigate those waters. And this is a concept I teach to my clients who are learning the impact method. And I call it pinning the issue, right? So there might be issues that you're not able to address right now. So, you might be a small organization with limited resources. I'm going to use the hiring example again. And you might be up for changing your hiring process, but the idea of putting a lot of resources into reaching out and overcoming the systemic issue of there not being enough female candidates for you to get a good selection of people knocking on your door and actually applying for the job, you might say, well, we recognize this issue of the systemic bias. We're going to choose not to address it right now. Now, I am not in any way saying that this issue isn't extremely important, but what I am saying is that if you get bogged down with trying to address too many issues in a complex system at once, you won't likely make progress in any direction. So the idea of pinning an issue means we've identified it. We're like literally writing it, putting it somewhere in the impact method. We have a place where we list our pinned issues so we don't forget them. We know they're there. We know they are impacting us, but we've also acknowledged that right now we're not going to be proactive, and we're also not going to react to the kind of the side effects of having not dealt with this issue, even though we're going to acknowledge that they are there. So I think this concept can be really helpful when it comes to tackling a big, complex issue like surgery or like diversity, equity, and inclusion, where there are many, many variables to consider and various levels of expertise and knowledge that can come into play and help us along the way. So right on the dot, that is our 15-minute micro training on how to use checklists to start taking action on diversity and equity inclusion and adding that lens to your organization. Today, there's no reason why you can't take 5 minutes to draft up a checklist and add it to one of your processes today. You've got time in the day right now. For those of you who'd love to speak with me one-on-one, you are welcome to apply for a free consultation call at pivotground.com/.